physical, but like what am I, dude? I'm
Social?
drunk. I can't think of it. Yeah, social characteristics.
I
Like,
hate Richard Dawkins so much.
Well, okay, Richard Dawkins has problems, but when it comes to his like
no
knowledge of
idea.
evolution,
I know that. Yeah.
yes, he knows what he's talking about. So it's like Jordan Peterson is a fucking idiot, but when he talks about psychology, he probably knows what he's talking about.
Yeah, he's a clinical psych. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, like when you breed foxes for things like domesticity, is that the right word? Then yeah, they actually start to develop physical traits that look like cats. They start to develop rounded ears.
Domesticfulness.
Domesticfulness.
All right.
We'll use domesticfulness.
No, domesticfulness.
Wait, he's messing with us again.
Of course I am.
I'm naive. You can't do this to me.
You believe?
I do.
Well, long story short, if you breed foxes like purely only choosing for like social characteristics, it will change their physical appearance. They'll get rounded ears like cats. Their tails will start looking more cat-like. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really interesting how they like test if they're like social or not. They'll pretty much like put them in a cage with humans, and most foxes, like wild animals, will just try to like stay away because they can't like eat us. But the ones that'll actually like
That's how I treat most of my food too.
the ones that will actually like come up and like sniff us and eye us for a bit, like they may not like directly interact, but those are the ones they choose to breed. It's a very like slow pace.
Mm-hmm. And it changes the appearance of the foxes. Like they're I don't know. Evolution's fucking crazy. It's wild.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and evolution's real. We all agree, right?
Well, hell no, brother. I got my Bible by my.
I mean, unironically, I am what is called a scientific anti. So.
Wait, you cut out anti-realist?
Scientific anti-realist.
Can you boil that down to like one sentence? What that means?
I believe that. It's less so maybe with evolutionary biology, but I believe that the entities that are posited by scientists can't really be said to exist, or at least can't be said to exist any more than anything else.
Okay.
But
what do you mean by entities in this case?
Like stuff like DNA, for example. Well, that's very extreme.
We can actually like take pictures of DNA.
That's why I'm not going to go that. I mean, there are some people that say like, as soon as you alter if you are viewing something through a lens, like you could see why the argument's ridiculous, right? Because I'm wearing glasses. So,
so literally everything you see is through a lens.
Right. So no, but I would say something like protons or subatomic particles can't be said to. I mean, it's not that we can't say that they exist, but that they are just as likely to exist as something else, right? So, like for example, when I rub my pant leg and then I touch like maybe like a metal, or I rub my blanket or something and I see sparks, right? That's the phenomena that we see, right? And then we posit electrons as being the cause of that spark, but we can never actually know that it's an electron. We can never see an electron. We don't know that it necessarily has the properties that it does. It could just as easily be like little gremlins that are like snapping their fingers or something, right?
You say never.
Come on to the same categorization as like scientific objectivity, where it's like objectivity that most scientists, a large amount of scientists agree on as being the case as far as like what works within the theories that they have, kind of thing.
Well, so I think what needs to get. I think that scientists need to realize that what they're doing, they're not really explaining the universe in a certain sense. They're trying to map a predictive model around the phenomena that we've observed, so that we can then go and interfere in the world, create new technologies, and so forth. So like evolutionary biology, I don't really know. I think that'd be different though, because I think biology in a sense can be said to exist because we can actually see the actual organisms. But like in theoretical physics, for example, I don't think the Higgs boson exists, or at least I don't think we can say that it exists.
But I mean, sorry to cut you off, but your description is kind of like saying that like scientists, you basically just like okay, I said basically twice. Anyways, I'm sorry. You basically just said that like scientists can't. You basically describe science though is like saying that like they're creating predictive models. That's basically what science is, right? Like
it is, but scientists also want to say that they're discovering the true nature of the world. and finding out the true entities that make up the material that is around us. I mean, it's a huge. You might not find that, and great, I agree with you. But a lot of scientists believe that is what they're doing.
Are you saying that these things are only as true as far as like we can perceive them to be true? Like
no, as far as they allow us to make predictions about phenomena in the universe. So they are explanatory, like the term. It's a guy called Bas van Frosten, who I actually will have the pleasure of meeting soon. It's this philosophy called constructive empiricism. It's the most famous notion of scientific anti-realism. And basically, all of these theories that we posit, what matters is that they are empirically adequate. They are capable of describing the phenomena that we want. And so we can ascribe electrons as doing it, things that behave in a cloud-like fashion, yada, yada, yada. But we could also just call them little gremlins, right? And ultimately, it's not going to change anything in our theories, except just the underlying ontology, the things that exist underneath the theories.
So why does I agree with you. If we have a model that can describe something like an electron, right? And if we have a model that can predict like how an electron will work and how it will affect our daily lives, like what matters if like the electron is like technically named Steve, as like long as we name it an electron, right? Like as long as we're able to, I just don't understand why that matters.
Well, because it's not just that, but it's also we ascribe properties to the electron, right? Like we've devised this model of charge, we've devised this model of spin. So these are all properties that we're assigning, but we could come up with a completely different model that doesn't invoke any of those properties, and the relationship between all these entities are going to be different, but the model will be just as successful in describing the phenomena that we're observing and is just as predictable.
So that still has to do with like our observation and like our interpretation of what's happening, right? But as long as our models of what is happening are consistent, then I guess I just don't understand why it matters, like how it's described. This to me almost seems like we use base 10, but other cultures in the universe might use like base 16, right? But as long as the math
that's a great way to think
like
about
why
it.
Does it matter?
I agree. So, and I absolutely agree with that. But if that is the case, then we have to sacrifice saying, there are actual electrons in the world. We can't say that. We cannot say that there's a thing called an electron.
Philosophy is stupid. I hate it.
Yeah. Well, but the reason it's very relevant is it comes up like, for example, in gender studies and whatnot, for a lot of these dopes trying to equate well, sex is just sex is it's absolute fact, and gender is a social construct and finds a social construct, but sex is sex. You can never not be your sex, right? And then you just say, well, look motherfucker, we can devise another model of sex. Sex is socially determined. Our scientific theories are in a sense socially determined. All that matters is that they're going to be predictive, and by admitting that sex is a social construct, that doesn't change the predictive utility, right? So people do actually appeal to science for things other than predictivity, which is what we have to, that's one of the things I want to push against.
You just fucked my whole worldview. God damn.
It fucked my worldview too. It's a very interesting topic. I mean, so I don't subscribe to that specific version of scientific anti-realism because it brings with it, like, the best objection I know to it is, like, so basically, like for the electrons, for example, we can take a picture of an electron, right, by looking through an electron microscope. And so it's a little bit cheaty, right, because we're using the very entity that we're trying to posit in our proof that this entity exists. So it doesn't really work.
But I mean, it still confirms our like theories about it, right?
Yeah, to a certain extent. And then, but then I would say, well, I can use my eyes and see that, this table exists, but it's because I'm not using any scientific instruments. Well, the argument is, well, what if you're born like with fucking electron microscopes taped to your eyeballs, right? Like, can we now absolutely say that electrons exist or something, right? Which is I like the objection because I just like to imagine a fucking baby coming out with massive fucking microscopes coming out of their eyes. So, yeah. Someone said in my chat, it's like solipsism. No, it's not solipsism. It's holding back certainty about how the world is like in a very specific domain. That's all. Within an empirical type of standpoint.
Wait, what was their name? Was it Archmage?
Archmage?
Yeah, was that the person who made the comments name? Because somebody made the comment at the same time.
Oh no, someone
wait,
PM'd me on my server.
Oh shit! Somebody put up that comment inside of my Twitch chat the moment you read it. So I was like, wait, is it the same person? We got fucking schemers. These schemers.
Archmage did nothing wrong, bro.
Yeah, I thought that was it.
But I mean, so when I say I'm a scientific anti-realist, like everyone's like, excuse me, right? Because they think, wow, do you like believe in a flat Earth and stuff? It's unfortunate that these names have the names that they do, right?
I mean, anti-realist does sound bad. Just
exactly.
Like
it means, but I think, for example, I think most people should be studying sciences because the utility of doing that, and it'll just make the world an overall better place.
Oh, for sure.
And obviously, we have to trust the consensus of scientists.
But what if they don't know the electron isn't named Steve?
Yep, very.
Well, that probably depends on what their field is.
Yes. I mean, ultimately, we just my argument is we have to set a line at what science can say and what it can't say, and we have to clearly delineate what the role of science can be, and not allow it to overstep its bounds necessarily.
Do you think that's possible to like set a hard line for like what science can and can't claim?
Well, yeah. I mean, science. Yeah, I mean, I set the line by saying it's a predictive tool. That's ultimately.
You don't think there's any way that science can go beyond that?
Not without changing. Not without
changing
like completely redefining. Yeah. But I mean, I think over time, I mean, the field could change, and like math, for example, could be absorbed into science or something, right? But as it stands right now, the way that scientists currently operate in the natural sciences, with their investigative tools, it's I have the same spiel about like people who call stuff pseudoscience and stuff, right? I ask them, well, what do you fucking mean by pseudoscience? And they have no fucking idea what to say.
Wouldn't pseudoscience just be like it has no predictive ability though? Because that's like half the whole point of like a scientific like.
Well,
theory.
but Higgs boson doesn't have predictive ability.
Wait, I thought the whole point was that they actually predicted.
Mass.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was.
I see what you're saying. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. But then also, do you mean successful predictive ability?
Well, because like the Higgs boson is like the result of a prediction, right?
Wait,
like so, the Higgs boson itself wouldn't have a predictive ability.
Well, then what about something? So we then have a very, very broad notion of what it means to be science. But the issue becomes, how does it have to be actual success? Like, okay, so this is the issue: is how do I explain this? You want to draw a distinction between true science and false science, and pseudoscience and science, because though there might be things like, for example, the like Newtonian mechanics, right? We don't want to call that pseudoscience, but it is false science because we know that it is factually incorrect based on experiments done by Einstein, right? But that's still science in its enterprise. It's just false science. So if predictivity and the ability to predict things is what we're concerned about, and it being successful at predicting things, I mean, I don't think that criterion works, because there are things we want to say are science, even if they aren't necessarily predictive.
Yeah, well, much like light is both a particle and a wave, science is both like a method, and it's like in application it's a predictive model, but like when you're trying to figure things out, it's a method at the same time. So like I guess we're really just talking about like how we define a certain word as opposed to like the actual applicability of like the scientific method and like the predictive model.
Well, the issue is really, what is the scientific method in the first place? What is the way that scientists...
I can Google it.
Yeah, but I'm sure that you'll have very vague terms like hypothesis and an experiment. Like what is how much is need? Here's a good example. If we want to say that we want to figure out the failure rate of a certain product, like let's say a belt, and I hypothesize that the failure rate is 5%. Okay, so then I take 200 belts, I test them, and the failure rate is 20%. Well, I'll say that my hypothesis is falsified based on that sample, right? But then let's say we have a vaccine and we want to figure out its failure rate. Well, 200 tests are not going to be enough to determine the efficacy of a vaccine. It needs to be applied at a far greater sample to be deemed acceptable.
Do you know, like, I'm actually curious, because I know like when it comes to things like polling, like you don't need a huge sample size. So I'm wondering, with something like a vaccine, does it really need to be that much bigger than like like exponentially bigger than a couple hundred?
I'm pretty sure it does, right?
I'm trying to draw
It
attention to
wouldn't
the fact
surprise
that
me.
the way that we determine when a scientific hypothesis is confirmed or not is very much relative to a certain type of individual, and it's going to vary field by field, project by project. So the scientific method is not something that can be said to be, like, it's completely contrived by humanity at the end of the day.
Yeah. So it's like the idea of like, how many times do I run this test? Like, for instance, on the vaccine test, what is enough for statistical significance? Do I do it 100 times? Do I do it 10,000 times? Do I do it 10 million times? Do I do it 10 billion times? How many times do you do it and why? Right. And that really comes down to like the accuracy that you think is required of the level, and that's arbitrary.
Right. Well, it'll be based in utility. It'll be based on a value judgment that you make. Yeah. And that's an issue for scientists, because scientists believe, or a lot of, not as much anymore, but this is only because of publishing in the philosophy of science. But there was for decades upon decades upon decades a view, a value-free ideal of science, where science, not concerned about anything about what should be the case at all. No values come into play. It's all about how the world is like. But philosophers of science then sort of realize that, well, science does not operate that way. On a day-to-day basis, scientists are employing their values in determining when a theory is confirmed, what amount of testing is required for a certain type of experiment. One of the most famous examples of a criterion for pseudoscience is falsifiability, which is if a scientific hypothesis can't be falsified, then it's not science, right? So that's how you get rid of something like astrology, right? You just say,
even like theoretically, false.
Exactly.
Yeah, it needs to be retestable.
Because if you can't falsify it, but like you have a scenario in which it could be falsified, then you're still good to go.
Yes. But so like something like, the theory of evolution, I mean, there are cases that would go so far against the current empirical theories of evolutionary biology that we would deem evolutionary biology bunk. Or, the Higgs boson. We ran the test of determining whether the Higgs boson exists. If we got a line, because it's all statistical modeling, if the statistical model didn't show the bump that was required to call this a Higgs boson, this irregularity, then we would say that the Higgs boson doesn't exist because it's falsified our hypothesis. There was no bump where we expected there to be a bump. Or even better, we would falsify the theory of gravity if all of a sudden, my fucking book started to float up into the air. But
so I'm sorry to interrupt. Isn't that what's like great about the scientific model though, is that they don't ever really make truth claims. They just make like degrees of certainty claims. Like when they say something is a theory, like it's effectively true, but that doesn't mean that they're saying it is true. And the moment that it's falsified, though, they will completely remove like germ theory, right? Like we call it germ theory because we use it as a predictive model and because we know how it works. But the moment that like there's something out there that falsifies germ theory, then we say, okay, bam, germ theory is falsified. We need to find a better theory that explains this stuff.
I mean, so it's because I tell you this was a good model, and it was a good model until everyone completely fucking abandoned it because of a lot
everything was going great until everyone died.
Yeah, I mean, there are still what are called because this was Karl Popper's notion, and there are still some neo-Popperians, so I don't want to suggest that absolutely no one adheres to it, but there was basically a discovery, not a discovery, but an argument made by William Van Orman Quine, came to be known as the Quine-Duhem thesis, which basically says, like, let's say, for example, that I'm running a test where, or here's a good example. In what year was Uranus discovered? Does anyone remember?
Did you have to say it like that?
Are you kidding me?
Oh, Uranus.
Wait, were we alive? Were we alive when that happened?
No, we weren't. We definitely were not alive.
Yeah, wait, what?
I was like,
I have.
I'm sorry. You said
1781.
the way you said. The way you said. Oh wait, really?
Yeah, Uranus was discovered March 13th, 1781.
Wow, it took a long fucking time. Holy shit. The way you said remember, I thought you meant like remember to the good old days. I was like, wait, what?
Yeah, it was just last year. What are you talking about?
Yeah, just last year. Oh, my bad. Must have missed it.
I can find the specific.
I'm pretty sure Uranus has a ring too, or is it Neptune? No, do we already
Also,
Oh, yeah, here we go.
that like I'm not doing much here, so I'm probably just gonna go and work on a video.
All right.
Nice meeting you.
6 hours.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah,
stopping by.
it was
Good
good hanging
seeing you
out.
again, Gushin.
Take it easy,
Rev
Grisha.
for sure.
and Ahrelevant ever want to fucking debate communism versus capitalism, they're more than
Oh,
welcome
yes.
to hit me up.
All
Okay.
right.
Yeah. Otherwise, catch you, man.
Adios.
Yes, for sure. Thanks for
Alright.
coming, Gushin.
You
Appreciate
have a
it.
great one, Gushin.
Okay, I found it. So yeah, so there was a scientist called Bouvard who derived, or Robert Doe. What a fucking pretentious name, Robert Doe. Like, holy shit, Robert Doe Bouvard. He derived these astronomical tables that basically account for the orbiting of the various planets around the sun, and they found that Jupiter, for some fucking reason, was sorry. They found that Uranus was behaving. So not discovery Uranus. Uranus was behaving in such a way that that didn't match the current model of Newtonian mechanics. And if we look at this by Popper's model, this should, in a sense, falsify the Newtonian model. We have an example of a phenomenon that goes against the current model in science. But instead, they didn't do that. They said, well, no, there must be something else wrong. So instead, they go out and they search and they realize, oh, actually, Neptune is causing this. There's some other planetary body that is adjusting Uranus's gravitational pull towards the sun. Why are you laughing at Uranus?
It's just, as far as I know, everyone calls it Uranus now. So it's like
Uranus. Sorry.
I don't ever hear that.
I've never heard Uranus in my entire
Everyone that I know calls it Uranus now. But yeah, I'm sorry. Just, I'm sorry. Keep going.
Yeah, and I mean that's a big issue, because all of a sudden people are unwilling to reject the hypothesis that is under consideration, and instead are going to argue that a bunch of the other observational statements that are being considered is actually at fault. Like, instead of questioning the very phenomena that we're seeing, we're going to find some other reason to choose not to falsify the theory. And it's unclear exactly how we can ever engage truly in a scientific method where we aren't sure which part of our theory we should reject. Do we reject the hypothesis? Do we reject one of the other assumptions that we're using in forming the hypothesis?
The
Do we reject?
methodology.
Do we reject? When they were doing tests at the Large Hadron Collider, there was tons of false positives. And it's not like they said, a Higgs boson exists now. No, they're going to say, well, no, it's probably something in the wiring, which it was.
To me, this all just proves how the scientific method is so effective, because whenever there's false positives like this, sure, sometimes it might slip through the cracks, but for the most part, these scientists seem to be so great at what they do that they say, yo, just because we confirmed our biases, we can't just take this at face value. We have to actually look at this. Oh, what was this? Oh, it was a bad it was a bad outcome. All right, we have to run it again. So like,
but the reason you think that is because scientific textbooks only favor the winners. So you don't get a picture of scientific theories that were around for so long and persisted for so long and were never refuted, right? It's one of the...
I'm sorry, I feel like I keep cutting you off.
No.
It seems like that our model now, I don't feel like this is one of the... Okay, so I know that you're not doing this, but this is what I hear from like creationists and also like race realists all the time, is like, oh, well, it's literally the argument from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Science is a liar sometimes. It's the argument that like, we were wrong in the past, so why can't we be wrong now? And it's like, no, we understand that we could be wrong now. The thing is that the science
we
is
are
a
almost
predictive model
certainly
now.
wrong now.
Exactly. At least not as correct as we think we are. But the thing is that the method that we have as a predictive model is so accurate, and whenever it's not accurate, we don't call it like a scientific theory, right? But whenever it's so accurate that we can literally use it at like 100% rate, or we can actually use it to like describe reality, then at least all we're saying when it's a fact, at least in the scientific model, is that we are so certain that it works in our current reality that we're okay with calling it a fact, even though it may not philosophically like be a fact. Like, again, the electron might need
it's a pragmatic decision. at the end of the day, which I agree with.
Sure.
And I mean, it's when in philosophy classes, because I've taken a bunch of philosophy of science classes now, and whenever you are being taught Thomas Kuhn for the first time, or a lot of these other anti-realist.
I saw Ahrelevant's face.
Let's move past it, dude.
It's K-U-H-N.
Leon, did you really get like? Okay,
No,
I was on the
okay.
same
One
page
of the
as
one of
you.
the persons on my like exam committee absolutely loved Thomas Kuhn, so I actually had to go back and read a little bit of his stuff just so I could like talk to him beforehand, because I knew I knew if I didn't throw that name out like as a reference, I was gonna get nailed on it.
Yeah, and he's one of my favorite philosophers, but whenever you're taught him, at least my professors and professors that I know always preface by saying you can't misunderstand what he is saying here. What he's saying doesn't give credence to every possible scientific hypothesis. All that is being shown is that science has a bound, and that science cannot be done in isolation. It always has to be done with reference to human values at the end of the day. And that's science, as properly understood, has to take into account that the way that science operates and has always operated is largely an irrational, in a weak sense of the word, project, because social factors and cultural factors constantly affect the way that scientists both conduct their programs and also how they decide what theories to ascribe to. Like a great example, Kuhn has a book called The Copernican Churn. There used to be this Ptolemaic model that believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe and that the sun revolved around the Earth. And the Copernican model said, well, no, actually the Earth revolves around the sun. But at the time that the Copernican model was largely adopted, it was not more predictive and it wasn't more accurate. All it was more aesthetically pleasing and more simple to use when making predictions. But it was just as predictive and it was just as accurate, because we didn't have the tools needed like telescopes, as the Ptolemaic model or as the Copernican model. So although they were correct in choosing that theory, as far as we know now, and it seems pretty certain that that's not going to change anytime soon, the factors that go into scientists' decisions are they are often very socially determined, very culturally determined. But admitting that doesn't mean that every scientific theory that anyone poses is correct. It just goes to show that science has to take into account the fact that sometimes what it's doing is not completely free of social influence and of social values.
Well, yeah, that's how we got phrenology. Like, science is very much so like influenced by, but I think at least in modern days, like there's no way to ever remove the social aspect from science because we are social creatures. It's impossible. But I think we at least try to do our best to remove the social aspects, or at least good.
I absolutely think that we need to minimize that, because although we have to recognize that everything is going to be tainted by values in some sort of sense, you should not misappropriate science for your values that will in turn sort of jeopardize the possibility of there being any sort of scientific consensus at the end of the day, right? Like race realists, right?
Racist, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Their theories are bunk empirically by every standard model of the scientific method. It doesn't match with fucking anything. Same with climate change deniers, right? It does not match.
It's anti-evolutionists.
Yeah, exactly. It's and I mean, the biggest issue I have with scientists are when they try to overstep their bound, right?
Like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson.
Exactly, Sam Harris. And I mean, there's a doctrine in philosophy, and I won't try to pretend that no one holds the opposite view of me in philosophy, because there are naturalists in philosophy that come from Quine who basically think that everything in philosophy needs to be done in a scientific method. It's all it's all done in that certain way. And this naturalistic worldview, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily, like, there's an amazing, if you're interested in evolution, actually I should send you this paper because it's absolutely fascinating. There's a paper by a philosopher and it's all the rage now, called Alvin Plantinga, who is a theist.
Ew, gross.
But it doesn't come into play in the argumentation. It's an incredibly well argued and very respected paper that basically argues that science is best suited to a theistic worldview than towards a naturalist worldview, and that everything in science or everything in evolution is compatible with a theistic worldview at the end of the day, because God could have created an evolutionary sound. I mean, that's why it's theistic, right? Because God isn't having intervention in the daily states of humans' affairs.
That was my last step to becoming an atheist when I was holding on to my religion, was that yes, evolution is true. I couldn't deny it anymore. But my idea was, well, God used evolution as his...
Right, but now you're no longer really religious, because all you're acknowledging is the possibility of there being an infinite being, but you can't ascribe any sort of religious doctrine to him.
Well, it depends. Like, at that point, I still believed in the Christian God, but yes, eventually that turned into, well, maybe it's not the Christian God, maybe it's some sort of, like, being...
that I'll never have any sort of contact with, that I'll never know. Yeah. I don't know what he wants me to do.
Yeah. And then that turned into just like, well, I can't ever know, so I have no reason to believe. And then agnostic atheism.
Right, and that's basically what I am. So I don't really give a fuck if I don't give a fuck if you're a theist or atheist. Well, it depends if you're ascribing like moral doctrine that comes out of your fucking ass.
Or voting, voting right wing.
Yeah, exactly. When you are when you're like a hardcore religious dogmatist or something. But
fuck that.
I mean, yeah, it's a great paper that basically argues that evolution, properly understood, is best suited towards a theistic worldview rather than a naturalistic worldview where no God does exist. Because people do seem to forget that by saying, like, scientists will say that, oh, I'm not doing any sort of philosophy when I posit that there is no God. I mean, you're wrong. You are positing that there is no God, and that is a project that has to be undertaken in metaphysics. You're going beyond the bounds of science when you are claiming that no God exists. And so you can't work within science to falsify, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to say it, to falsify the Christian God. I cannot believe I just said that.
Did you say that this is the evolutionary argument against naturalism?
Yes, it is. Okay. That's exactly what I think that's what the paper's called.
I found the Wikipedia. I was looking for stuff. I found the Wikipedia page. So.
Yeah. And I mean, there's lots of, like, I don't agree with the argument. Like, there's a lot of premises that are sort of assumed and not argued for very well. But it's a very, it's a compelling, piece of philosophy that, it's worth exploring. And it changes your perspective on the way that science is related to, questions of religion and whatnot. But I mean, I'm not religious or anything, so.
Would you say, in the way that you kind of said that science needs to know its bounds on what it can and cannot claim is truth or whatever? Would you say the same about philosophy, that it needs to know its bounds? Absolutely. As well?
100%. Yeah. I mean, like science needs philosophy. Philosophy needs science. Absolutely. It's one of the a philosopher who I got to speak with. Like, he's probably the most famous philosopher of science in the past century, a guy by the name of Ian Hacking. He's written like the standard textbook in the field, and it truly, like, have you heard of the name Wittgenstein?
Yep.
Yeah, I've heard the name.
So.
Very famous, like one of the most famous philosophers probably ever. Ian Hacking was the student of his student, and so when I went to go interview him, he had like a note on his wall signed by Wittgenstein, and I totally lost my shit at that. Yeah, but
that's cool.
Austrian philosopher is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Is that who you're talking about?
Yeah, Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Right. I'm literally just Wikipediaing everything you're saying because I'm like very introductory to philosophy, and I want to learn more.
Yeah, that's the way to do it, I guess.
Yeah.
And so Ian Hacking is what is called an entity realist, which basically says, well, look, if we can causally interact with the entities that we're describing, then we can say that they're real because there's some sort of like causal connection. Like when I like hit a billiard ball, there's an actual entity that we know is having an effect put on it. And in the same way, I can take an electron and fire it at something and have a causal effect in the world. So there's definitely an entity that exists right there. I mean, it's a very complicated argument, and I don't agree with it. But the point is that science and the way that scientists conduct their work has to be conducive, in a sense, with philosophy, because the very phenomena that philosophy is trying to explain is reliant upon the findings within science. And so if philosophy tries to impose a certain type of arbitrary standard of going about science, then I think it's ultimately an inconsistent type of behavior to do, because it's like, when you're trying to go to sleep and you're thinking like, oh, I really, really want to go to sleep, and you're trying to force it, and then you can't go to sleep at all. So if philosophy is really, really trying to search for the truth of the world, and it tries to impose itself within science without any familiarity with science and the backing of, scientific knowledge, then it's going to put its foot in the wrench and basically go counter to the aims of philosophy, which is to understand the world. They're going to basically halt scientific progress and try to impose a bunch of, not dogmatism, but a bunch of views upon scientists, which might ultimately be correct, but are going to conflict so much within the field that we lose all the pragmatic benefits that science ultimately gives us. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a sort of division between the two, but we have to recognize that they do ultimately need each other for each of their projects. That's what I would probably say on that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Say, one of the things I personally struggled with trying to figure stuff out, because coming from a science background, was the idea that someone like Robert Oppenheimer, who's in charge of the Manhattan Project, father of
the nuclear bomb,
but he was considered not equipped to talk about the ethics of dropping the bomb, despite the huge thing he had involved with it, right? Because that was more of an idea of philosophy, whereas he was a scientist.
Well, I mean, football players are great at hitting other football players in the head, but that doesn't mean that they're equipped to talk about the morals of hitting other football players in the head.
That's a pretty damn good analogy. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty good.
And so for example, I know Ahrelevant, you're an emotivist, but I think you would even agree with this, that even within an emotivist system, someone who studies ethics and the way that, ethical propositions relate to one another is going to be more equipped to determine what is going to be good for you within a certain person's, framework. For me, objectively, we should defer to the, the professional ethicist about it.
Well, yeah, some people like I said, some people literally do that that shit with veganism, right? Where they don't recognize what I did, right? For instance, I wouldn't eat a kid, but I'm willing to eat several or I'm not willing to eat a brain dead person, but I'm willing to eat an animal. Makes no fucking sense in many different ways. But some people just don't realize that shit.
Yeah, so one of the biggest tasks I think of ethical philosophers is to really examine different ethical doctrines and trying to highlight the inconsistencies that exist within those theories. And if they find those inconsistencies, you try to weed them out and apply it. And so for someone who doesn't have any ethical background, it's not to say that they're completely wrong in what they think is good. It's just that they're going to be less equipped to make a huge, obviously, fucking informed, to drop a bomb, for example, have any sort of input on that decision. But this is why I think that ethicists should be consulted more on, well, it's not that they aren't. In Canada, we're very good at it, actually. We just passed active euthanasia in Canada, and that was done through a panel of bioethicists and
what exactly
ethicists.
Is that?
Yeah, I was going to say, could you explain?
So euthanasia is the act of allowing a patient to die.
Yeah.
And passive euthanasia was allowed, where you basically you choose not to help the individual. So
Terry Schiavo.
Yeah, so if they need a certain pill or something, you just don't give it to them and you let them naturally pass. Active euthanasia would be giving them a shot to directly kill them.
I'm assuming they have to
sounds way better.
Request it. I'd make that assumption that they have to request that.
Not always. For example, if someone was hit in the head, put into a coma, it now gets deferred to their direct family members.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, but yeah, in most cases, it's always informed. But active euthanasia for a very long time was ruled simply, illegal, because people view huge issue in bioethics and philosophy of action about doing versus allowing. And
so again, I'm sorry, I feel like I keep cutting off.
No, go ahead.
So does this have to do a lot with like how doctors interpret? I don't know what other countries use, but like in America, we use the Hippocratic Oath, right? Which like the very beginning is first do no harm. So is this how we like interpret the idea of doing no harm? Because the way we interpret it now is like we can't do euthanasia because euthanasia is inherently doing harm. Whereas if we interpret it in a different way to say that euthanasia is actually reducing the harm because maybe this person living every day is inherently doing harm. So by committing euthanasia, that's reducing harm. So I guess this is just like reinterpreting how we see like what is doing more and or less harm.
I mean, so you could either say that, or if you believe in like, these objective forms of morality, you'd say that we're actually getting closer to a proper analysis of what it meant in the first place. So we're getting closer to what it actually means to do good or to allow for proper well-being. I mean, one of my biggest issues actually in bioethics is something like the Hippocratic Oath, because within it the reality is, the way that I call it toolbox philosophy, right? You go to normative ethics, which is a study of what is good. You have all these theories. You have deontology, which respects autonomy. You go to virtue ethics, which says that you can't perform vices in extreme. So you have to behave in a way such that it's conducive to having a flourishing life. I mean, it's incredibly vague, so it's not really used in bioethics, but. And then, utilitarianism, which says, you need to minimize the harm done to people, maximize well-being. And you basically take all of these principles from all these different ethical theories, which are not compatible with each other. They are not compatible, at least in the way that they are usually understood. You toss them in a toolbox, and you're presented with a medical case, like, for example, active euthanasia, and you try and pick and choose which of these principles are going to match up with the case. And I mean, properly understood, every single time they do this, they are unjustified, really.
Yeah, and they would be contradicting, like,
right. But the alternative to that, right, is, well, we don't do anything.
Which could cause even more harm potentially, right? Like,
exactly. And under every ethical system, that is not good. Yeah. So you sort of bite the bullet and say, okay, we're not going to be right all the time. But because there is disagreement in ethics about what is going to be the good thing to do, and there's no way we can impose upon an entire country this correct form of ethics about autonomy or well-being, we can't make all doctors or all citizens, when voting for politicians or something, believe in utilitarianism. So we ultimately just have to go with sort of a synthesis of all of these theories, because we think at the end of the day it's going to be better than just going like off of the cuff. And I mean, it's a big issue with bioethics. It's one of my, it's called principlism. And it leaves like a really bad taste in my mouth just to think that, that's the way that this thing is, because, people are dying, we're having to choose who to save. And it's all being done in a completely logically contradictory way. There's no possible way that these decisions are being made.
Yeah, it seems like the goal so far, like the only thing that we've accomplished so far is like reducing the amount of blame that we can put on doctors, or like helping doctors' consciences, right? Like it seems like that's all we've really accomplished. So what I would also be curious about too is like in cases like capital punishment, right? Because somebody like me, I'm very much against capital punishment in like every single form. But at the same time, right now it's being carried out by other prisoners who have no medical training, and how a lot of times it's botched, right? Like these people who are going through capital punishment are suffering a lot more. But because of the Hippocratic Oath, doctors aren't allowed to implement capital punishment. But I guess you could make the argument that like the current system that we have is causing these people more harm. Therefore, in order to reduce the amount of harm that we're doing, it would be best to have a medical professional doing this. Or we could just abolish capital punishment, but whatever.
Yeah,
Baby
well,
steps,
I mean,
I guess.
One of the biggest, so there are certain, like, for example, like passive euthanasia, for example, is a case where there are cases of passive euthanasia where you don't have the toolbox problem, because every single principle is going to lead you to the same conclusion. So I think under any consistent, probably like plausible moral theory, the answer will be yes, you should allow the patient to die. You respect the patient's autonomy. So that's meaning something like the categorical imperative. You are respecting their well-being, because if they're in a state where they want to be passively euthanized, then they almost certainly are going to be living a life that is not going to be good. They're going to be experiencing pain. So you're meeting, the requirements of these ethical theories. But then a case like active euthanasia, you run into conflict, because if you are actively killing someone, well, see, no, even this is why I support active euthanasia, because if they have the autonomy to say, yes, I want you to kill me, who are you to say, that you shouldn't do this? But
with passive euthanasia, I feel like you run into even more problems than you would in active euthanasia, because in passive euthanasia, you're still allowing a person to die. But I feel like if you're just allowing them to die of their disease, that probably causes a lot more harm than like just getting it over with, like putting them to sleep.
I see. Yeah, well, I usually it's done in a way that, that's why there was a push for active euthanasia, is for that exact same reason. Yeah, but I mean, the issue is because the idea is you shouldn't kill someone, right? And this is you should never really kill someone, and so
generally agreed upon.
Generally.
And so if you believe in this universal rule, then even if someone wants you to kill them, the idea is, well, you shouldn't be able to do that. And that's why there was so much pushback against active euthanasia. And really, I think the best argument to be made is that there really is no real distinction to be made between allowing someone to die when you are capable of preventing them from dying and actually killing them.
I agree. Yeah, I actually totally agree.
There's this fantastic thought experiment with Jones in a bathtub, where Jones plans on entering his bathroom where his little brother is sitting in the bathtub, and he plans to drown him. And so in the first scenario, he goes in and he drowns his brother. And then the second scenario, he walks in, he's about to grab him to drown him, and he slips and falls.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't do anything. He just watches him drown. So in one case, he allowed him to die. And then in the other case, he actively drowned him. The question is allowing him to die really like not as bad as drowning him?
There's a TV show or movie that I watched that they like explicitly talk about this, and I wish I could remember what it was and like what conclusion they came to.
House? Was it House or something?
No, it wasn't House, but it was probably something like that.
I mean, it's a tough question.
It feels like watching this happen would be just as bad as actually killing them, but then I could totally see a bunch of situations where that would it wouldn't play out the same. I don't.
Well, yeah, I think there are situations that allowing harm can be, especially if you add orders of separation to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, what if I leave what if I leave the cage to my I have a dog. I leave the cage open for the dog. The dog somehow goes out of the dog door, like runs all the way down the street, starves itself all of a sudden because it couldn't find its way home, and then eats a child. Am I responsible for that? Like all of those steps along the way. You know what I'm talking about?
So one of the reasons why the Jones scenario was set up the way it is because we want to find out if allowing or doing alone have any what is called a morally salient effect on the issue. So we isolate all the variables and purely want to determine, is there any real moral difference? And if the answer to the Jones is no, then all of a sudden, but you're right, because we want to say that, well, like you shouldn't be held morally culpable for allowing this to happen. Well then, but reaching this conclusion in the Jones case, where we say they're just as bad as each other, leads us to conclude in this dog case that it's not the allowing it to happen that mattered, right? Yeah. It was about proximity from it, and crucially, the intention behind it. Because if you intentionally left your dog's cage open, well, then suddenly you're a lot more morally culpable, I think, than otherwise. So
and it's like what? Yeah, I don't know. This gets into implications for, like, for instance, right, property existing in like a capitalist society and things like that, or continuing to fund U.S. military. It's like how many steps also away from the issue do you need to be before you're morally culpable? I mean, because I think there are some people
dying in Africa every day.
Exactly.
I feel like this is
donating money to them actively and stuff like that. And
it goes to the moral demandingness of It's a huge issue, and that's a big issue with utilitarianism specifically. Is like utilitarianism is incredibly morally demanding.
Isn't the
it's fucking stupid at times, really, really dumb at times.
Well, that's why you modify the theory to like have like clauses in there where you it's like the sleeping thing, right? If you try to go to sleep too much, you're not. It's the same thing. If you try to do too much good, you're not going to be able to do good.
Yeah, exactly.
As good.
It's a classic. Yeah,
that's like Watchmen. The whole story of Watchmen is they tried to do too much good, and so they did a whole bunch of bad.
I bought Watchmen, the comic book, and I haven't. I need to read it.
I bought it for my dad and brother for Christmas because we watched the TV show, and the TV show is very, very good, and I recommend it to everyone. Yes, I loved it. I thought it was great. I was only like, I've never read the graphic novel, but I've seen the movie, and I'm familiar with the graphic novel. Yeah, the show's great. As long as you're like vaguely familiar and you know the general story of the movie or the graphic novel. Yeah, no, I loved it personally. It's great. I recommend it to everyone.
Well, I will read it over the Christmas holidays then. Oh, that sounds good.
Check out the show too afterwards.
Yeah. But see, it's funny, talking about all this. No, well, but Ahrelevant, it's funny, like talking about all this. I mean, you've understood what I'm saying in philosophy, like so far, right? Like I feel like I'm.
Well, no, I mean, for sure, I understand what you're saying, and
I want to highlight though that these types of discussions are just so incredibly easier to have. Big questions like, what is the true nature of existence, and can we ever truly have knowledge of anything outside of us?
What does that question even mean? That question doesn't mean anything.
So it's easy to see how you can talk past each other so much when you get to such a high level area.
Sure, that just seems like opinion too.
I was you got something to say, Rem? But like, yeah, no, of course it happens. Like, for instance, I think in reference to like I don't know, you've expressed complaints about me referring to myself as utilitarian, but allow me to break through this just for a moment. In reference to like me, what I'm concerning to be my utilitarian framework and what I consider, because I remember you had an earlier complaint about the problems with what well-being even is in reference to things like utilitarianism and things like that. I think we actually agree based on one of the ways that I heard you interpret things like objective morality of being an agreed upon standpoint to a degree. I know I'm gonna misinterpret what you said because I just for the simple lack of memory on my part. But like, for instance, like I ground that idea of well-being to an agreed upon standpoint in order to make it more not only pragmatic, but also more like viable to be able to have something that people can see, right? And I usually do this by appealing to a utopia, personally. So like when I refer to like utilitarianism, like what is good, it's in reference to this gets us closer to a utopia, right?
Right. The ultimate issue is like worrying about consensus, right? Is exactly. A big, because I know you have the situation that I don't think it's a completely misguided intuition that consensus needs to be if someone is not capable of seeing that this is what like the truth of the matter is, if people are not capable of easily coming to appreciate what it means to be good at all, then what the fuck is the purpose of the definition?
Well, that stems from expressivism, right? Because if in expressivism, right, there's no way for me to say somebody's not morally right to do whatever the fuck they want.
Before we establish, like, if you're trying to choose between the different theories of good, like whether it be expressivism or utility, I guess if you're expressivist, you can also be utilitarian. But like expressivism or a form of cognitivism or error theory, when you're trying to choose between these meta-ethical theories, you want to have a theory that is conducive to the fact that everyone should be able to arrive at the conception of the good and understand what it means. And so
I'd say so, yeah.
Yeah, because you have that very pragmatic type of way of going about things. And I fundamentally disagree with that because I do not think that consensus really imparts any sort of value at the end of the day before we can establish that meta-ethical theory in the first place.
I get it. I think a great example of this is, for instance, you just I want like some people to think, like, at least deal with the idea that the earth is flat or it wasn't necessarily made by God, and you want to get to an idea in your mind that is the earth is not flat and was not made by God. In fact, it is round or oblate, spheroid, whatever the fuck, to be specific, and it was not made by God. You want to be more specific and not really have to worry about the pragmatism as far as like laymen go. And I mean, I've said this so much. I do concern myself with the pragmatic implications of what that is.
So okay, but like I think
Deal
we
with
could reach sort
laymen.
of a synthesis in this, maybe in the fact that we can still engage in like the purely theoretical, non-pragmatic task of arriving at certain philosophical positions, right? And then determine, based on what is the best way to get that across to people in a way that they will be able to understand it, be able to agree with it, right? But I don't think that necessarily entails
yeah, I know, getting rid of the accuracy of your methodology. And I completely agree with that. That's, in fact, one of the only reasons why I'm so interested in talking with you. It's because specifically I think that you're probably the best resource for me to be able to go about that.
Well,
and if I do go about that, then I'm able to, we're able to more accurately do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes, our disagreement has come from a very deep-rooted disagreement of Mindwaves. This is like a couples therapy sort of thing going on right now.
It's pretty cute, yeah. I like it.
It's like it comes from a very deep-rooted methodological difference that we both have when we come to approaching philosophy. I mean, and that's one of the deepest issues. I mean, that's what divides philosophers and like puts them at each other's throats, are these methodological disagreements. Like you'll talk to a Hegelian, someone who just fucking loves Hegel, and they'll talk to someone who's in like hardcore analytic, you know, because like Hegel writes super fucking flowery, like, ooh, the night sky, how the owl of Minerva soared. And, you know, the fucking, you know, logician who's like, what the fuck are you saying? Like, this isn't fucking philosophy. You're fucking writing me a poem, right? And these are two very, very stark methodological differences about how to even do philosophy in the first place. And I mean, I think if I want to go on and do my PhD and I ultimately want to write a thesis on philosophical methodology and finding sort of a neutral ground under which these different areas can discuss with one another, because I have Hegelian friends who I don't know what the fuck they are talking about. I have absolutely no fucking idea at all. Like they talk about the unfolding of logic, of nature, and, you know, the dialectic and the motherfucking like science of logic. And I'm like, what are you saying? These are all this is meaningless garbage to me, right? Because I come from such a different standpoint. But I mean, I think at the very root of it, we're still talking about the same things.
Yeah.
It's just the method by which we talk about these things are so incredibly distinct from one another. And the attempt of good philosophy is going to be uncovering, you know, all of underlying stuff.
I find that idea really interesting, especially I've been reading a book recently called A People's History of the United States, and he talks about in this book how the way that you were talking about, how like the way that different people talk and the way that helps them like interpret philosophy. He talks about, like, I've been reading a lot about like the Native Americans, and they say how even the Native Americans, like the way that they used language was very
yes. Oh no, okay. Okay. So this is something. Wow, I love it.
Well, to make it clear what we're talking about,
Well, I've written an undergraduate thesis. Like my area of specialty in philosophy is philosophy of language, and a very, very specific part of philosophy of language. It's a philosopher called Gottlob Frege. He basically founded like modern logic as we know it, but he had this principle in language called the context principle, which very simply states the meaning of a word can only be given in the context of its sentence. So words are only ever ascribed meaning depending on the sentence in which they're used. And through enough steps, you can basically arrive at the conclusion that the words in our language, we understand what they mean only depending on the language in which we use them. So, for example, there's something called the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, which basically says if you're from a completely different language family, a completely different linguistic entity, you are going to interpret the world in a completely different way. The world will literally be different for you in the way that you understand it than someone who, for example, speaks English.
Yeah, like we're very like straight and to the point, but they would say like the languages and like the Native American languages would be like they would describe things like they would say, "You have come in to us like a wolf goes to a lion," or like
Exactly.
they would always say like I guess analogies like that in a way that we don't use.
It's like have you watched Star Trek at all?
I mean, it depends on which one you're talking about. Yes.
TNG.
A little bit. Is that the Picard one?
Yes.
Yeah,
There's an episode of it called Dharma, which is literally Picard. He's onto an alien planet, and their communicators stop working, and he's meeting with this ambassador of this civilization. But he keeps talking about like Dharma Gelada, spread the ocean wide and stuff, right? Like just a bunch of fucking like statements of different events that have happened, and the whole project is him trying to understand what each of these events refer to in a way that they can then communicate with one another. And it clearly was
arms wide.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a great Ask Historians friend, or Ask. It was a great April Fool's thing. Yeah. Someone said in Ask Historians for April Fools, what happened at Shaka when the walls fell? Someone says Kira Bashi Zinda, his face black, his eyes were right in totally. But it's exactly what the Native Americans did. That's where they got their inspiration for the episode from.
That makes sense. Yeah, it was just crazy, like how Howard Zinn was like talking about like their differences and just like how they understood the world as compared to like the American, I don't know, with the imperialists. I don't know what you call them, people that were like, coming into their lands. Yeah, it was wild. And what you were talking about, the way that people like interpret philosophy, it just reminded me of that. That's
one of the things that I deeply regret is, I mean, it's not really something I can control, but they're like, I study Western philosophy. That's just the nature of the way that philosophy is currently structured in the academic setting. It's getting better over time. We are incorporating more non-Western ideas into the canon, but it's a very slow process because, the teachers have been taught the Western canon. And so the teachers are going to teach the students the Western canon. So it's about hiring people who are more familiar with the broader worldview. It's sort of a vicious cycle in a sense, but I don't have the time because of my studies to be reading, for example, Native American philosophy and, Eastern philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Middle Eastern philosophy.
Is there actually a lot of like Native American philosophy?
Oh, yeah.
Wow,
I mean, and it's important that people learn it now because unfortunately that culture is dwindling out. A lot of very important ideas have been lost because of imperialism.
I feel like it would be, if it was a species, it would be effectively extinct, like that culture.
Yeah,
like,
in a lot of places.
Die out. Like,
like
it's just a matter of time, which sucks.
I deeply care about like, I mean, I'm from Canada, and a lot of people think Canadians are, ooh, we're so friendly and whatnot. But I mean, we treated the native populace in Canada just horrendously. Like I think 40 years ago, we had residential schools, and we would strip children away from their parents, and it, just this awful, disgusting behavior. And it took us years and years and years to apologize for it. And people in Canada don't even know this. They have no idea. They have no idea what's going on. And I mean, we still treat them like shit in so many ways. And we need to respect their sovereignty. The Trudeau government continually tries to push their pipeline through native sacred land.
You call that subjugation, bro? We're from fucking America. We know how to subjugate our nation, all right? You want to talk about subjugation?
The most salient example of clear imperialism that has happened in the past 20 years was the which referendum was it? I believe it was the 1995 Quebec referendum, when Quebec voted whether or not to leave Canada or not and become its own country. Pardon?
They're still trying to do that too, right? Quebec?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's
Parts
always
of Quebec,
there, but I don't think it'll gain any real movement.
Like nationalistic parties,
Yeah, exactly. And so they arranged this whole vote for all Quebec citizens to, vote whether they want to stay or not. And, it ended up, it was like 50.1% voted no, 49.9% voted yes. And thank fucking God. But no one asked, the Cree people who live in the majority of Quebec as a landmass is native Cree territory or native territory in general. Literally, basically all of the North is considered native territory, and no one fucking asked them if they wanted to leave Canada. So they conducted their own poll, and like 99.8% of the native Cree people said we want to stay in Canada. And one of the factors that the American government, because all these documents were eventually released, what they were worried about is, well, how can they leave Canada and bring the Cree people with them when the Cree people want to stay in Canada? What is Quebec going to look like? Because it can't keep its current shape. And what about those native people that are interspersed with the native Quebec, not native, the francophone Quebec populace? What the fuck are you going to do? You can't just kick them out of that territory. That's their native land. I mean, I don't fucking know what would have happened. I think that would have put the nail in the coffin of them being able to leave Canada, because I don't see any way that they can deal with that, especially when most of the natural resources are in Cree territory. So you basically leave Canada without the natural resources to really become a sovereign nation. But during this entire process, no one fucking thought about the native people. No one. And it was disgusting. And yeah, it's really fucking horrendous.
Unfortunately, too, like I feel like we hear a lot about that in the, I guess the Eurocentric world. And when I say that, I don't mean Europe necessarily, but like between Australia and like the North America, we hear about that a lot. But even in like Bolivia, now that Evo Morales has been like ousted, I've heard that like the native population's getting fucked over there.
Yep. Oh yeah.
So it's just like normal, it feels like, for like native populations to get fucked no matter where they go. And that seems pretty shitty, especially when you have like a lot of racists talking about how the founding stock needs to be the one who decides how a country works. And you're like, all right, well then how does the United States go? Founding stock just means either white people or where that's like where white people came from, or white people wherever they conquered. So it's
I mean, people talk about, black reparations. Well, what about native reparations? I mean, they committed literal genocide.
Oh yeah.
Against, these individuals. And
there's so many. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's just like I started to read books on it, and like it literally makes me feel physically ill thinking about how much suffering has been caused, and both the fact that people don't know about it and that people just don't care about it. And it's one of the things that pisses me off the most. Yeah,
it's pretty bad. And it seems like it would be very easy to take steps to like help these communities, at least within the United States, because right now all we've done is said, hey, we'll either like let you open casinos, which helps like a very small portion of like the indigenous population, or I don't know what else, like maybe a little bit of subsidies towards schools. But it seems like if you would just like, hey, I don't know, just like it seems like it would be pretty easy to just make some small changes that would actually like help implement these people or help push these people towards like being accepted like the regular community the way that anybody else is. And
I mean, we're actively trying to take the right to vote away, right?
That's true. So I don't know about the United States, but in Canada, like I can't pretend like if there's like it's not an easy, like people are like, well, why don't you do more to help, because they have one of the highest poverty rates, they have the highest homicide rate, like across the board, they are suffering more than. And the question is, well, what can we do right now to help them? And there is no easy answer to this, because if you look at where these people live, they live so far away from every other, habited area that, like, for example, how do we get clean water to them? Like, we can open like a water treatment plant, but that's literally for 200 people. And that would cost millions upon millions of dollars. There's no feasible way for us to do that. So we can't really provide them with clean water in a satisfactory way. And what is the alternative to that? Oh, well, come live with us. Well, then we're removing them from their sovereign land. And then there's the issue of corruption, where a lot of these native officials are super fucking corrupt, and they are not helping the native people do. But
that's a problem in the United States,
How can the Canadian government now go into these autonomous, tribes and try to dictate who is and who isn't corrupt? Isn't that just another example of imperialism? And so the attitude is like, well, we sort of just have to let them get through it themselves, because we can't go in and kick out these corrupt officials. The people themselves, in a sense, have to, take a stand against these corrupt individuals. And it's a really, really tough issue. And I do have a lot of sympathy for the Canadian government, in a sense, because they are not at all in an easy position to deal with the issues. They were like 80 years ago, because that's when they all fucked it up. But after all the chaos that has happened and, the disaster that has struck all these people, I mean, picking up the pieces and cleaning up the mess just makes it a lot, that's a lot to ask of anyone. So I wish we could just like give them everything that they need, but there's no way.
Yeah.
Yeah. The way that they lived, right, is not conducive to high productivity at all. But that shouldn't detract from their value as human beings.
No, I mean, like, well, look at like the Amish communities, right? Like, they're allowed to live however the fuck they want, but they're still prosperous. They still don't have the issues that like the indigenous communities have, because they haven't been just like crushed under the heel of the United States government like the indigenous community.
I mean, but in the United States, it's a bit easier because the United States is big, but it's pretty evenly inhabited. Well, Canada, basically 90% of all people who live in Canada live below like this bit, and then all of this is just,
it's all near the border, right?
Yeah, it's all near the border. It's all near the border, and all of these tribes usually live way, 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 way up north. Like it would take like a day to drive there. So
I'm from Texas, dude. I know what fucking long distance is.
Yeah, exactly.
I fucking get it.
Yeah, and so like because we don't want to be paternalistic, we want to respect their autonomy, but we also want to help them. So how do we help them in a way that isn't paternalistic?
So what I'm hearing is that Canada is like upside down world Brazil.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
I think the best thing to do is to say that like we should probably listen to like these communities to figure out what they want us to do to help them, right? But then even then, a lot of these communities are divided on like what the right direction is. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a real. Yeah, it's all fucked, really.
Hey, at the end of the day, neither of us are Australia, so we're doing pretty good.
That's true. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Yeah, Australia's probably one of the worst cases for sure.
Yeah.
So
they're still fucking it up in every possible way.
Yeah, that's almost certainly true.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, in Bolivia, of course, now they are. I mean, the interim leader is literally a fascist, so that's great.
Oh yeah, she's the one that said like the indigenous people don't belong in cities. They're like Satan's.
That was a fake tweet.
Oh, was that fake? I could have sworn that.
I got called out on that. That was a fake tweet, but she did call them all demons.
Okay, well then that was the bad part of the tweet. So
I thought the displacement was the worst. Was a worse than calling them demons, because like.
Yeah. Okay,
no, it's still pretty fucking bad, isn't it? I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not good, no matter how you slice it.
Nope. Not good. No, that's a tick off the scorecard for sure. What's the next topic, Mindwaves?
Fuck if I know. Leon, what's the next topic, my dude?
Dude, are we still going? I don't know if I got any topics.
I'm ready to wrap it up personally.
Yeah, I am too. I mean, we covered what we wanted to cover as well, Ahrelevant. So
I'm not gonna lie. I'm queuing up
actually
for Destiny 2 PvP right now.
Nice.
As we speak.
Oh.
Yeah. I need to go to bed. So
I should probably go to bed. It's almost 4 a.m.
If you want, I guess if you
wholesome fucking stream, boys.
This was fun. I had a blast.
True.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, I still do want to talk to you about the Earth existence thing, Rem.
We can clarify that soon. Yeah.
All right.
I don't know what the fuck y'all are talking about, but I know I want to listen to it.
All right.
Yeah.
That's good.
All right. Well, with that being said, let's go ahead and do outros, and then we'll wrap it up.